Welcome everybody, my name is François Letarte and this is my channel JDR-D30, a channel about tabletop role-playing games. Today it is the first video of the walkthrough of Advanced Fighting Fantasy, a game that is published by Arion Games. Today the subject of the walkthrough will be simply an introduction to this game. Well, first of all, I want to show you where this game comes from, because the actual Advanced Fighting Fantasy is considered to be the second edition, so there was something before. Well, where does it come from? First of all, it comes from fighting fantasy game books. These books, like this one, I'll show it to you. Was the first one written in, I think, 1982. This is Warlock of Firetop Mountain. This is a choose your own adventure book. It's kind of a very basic kind of a role-playing game. There's no role in that. You just make decisions, and if you haven't played that, the way it works, you read a paragraph. Each paragraph is numbered, and at the end of the paragraph you have choices about what happens next in the story. Maybe you have 2-3 choices, and that leads you to another paragraph, and so on. Every time you read the book, it can be a different story, so you take decisions, and you have some kind of a character sheet in that. You create a hero, standard way to create the hero. Here's the adventure sheet, and you have stats like skill, stamina, luck, to make your character, and you have to roll that randomly. This book, written by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, I don't know if I say it correctly. At first, it wasn't intended to be that kind of a game book. It was supposed to be a book on how to understand a role-playing game and play it, because they felt that role-playing games sometimes was difficult to understand. I read or saw somewhere that Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, when they had their first copy of Dungeons and Dragons, they didn't know at all how to play this game. They had to see other people play to understand what was going on. So they felt that the world needed a book to explain that. And by writing this book, it became a choose your own adventure. So they created a small scenario to explain how the rules could work, and they created a very simple system of rules. The Fighting Fantasy series became hugely successful, and there was a need to write more and more and more. So being that successful, it eventually became an introductory role-playing game simply called Fighting Fantasy. Show it to you closer. Okay, this book came after the success of the first few game books, and it is essentially the same rule system, but you learn how to do it in a role-playing game. You create the character exactly the same way, and that's all. You have the same kind of character, and in this book you have the 2 small scenarios, and they explain how to run a game if you are the game master. So that's where fighting fantasy fans discovered the openness of role-playing game through this. So it is meant to introduce new players, young players, and it really it's really good at that. As I said, the rules are very basic. It's the same thing as in the book. There's no magic system in that. If you want to run some kind of a spellcaster, I guess you could inspire yourself with what some game books has as a system. There's books like Citadel of Chaos or the Sorcery series. In these books, you cast spells, so I guess you can do that in that book. But there's a lot of fudging in that book in order to make it whole. And there's no skill system. Yes, you have a stat called skill, mainly for combat. But in this, they suggest a way to deal with unusual situation where a die roll could be necessary. What they suggest is that the game master decide on the difficulty and you roll that only on one die. So the character may say, "Oh, I want to jump across this ravine," and the game master say, "Okay, it's quite large, so roll a d6, and you have 1, 2, you succeed, 3, 4, 5, 6, you fail." That could be it. The game master choose what the player could roll, and that's it. I like. Well, in some way, I find that it's okay to do that, and it can be quite good, in fact, because the game master judges by the situation. If you want to play this game with maybe more richness to it, a suggestion I may have is to flesh out a good background for your character. So if you have the same situation about crossing a ravine by jumping by it, and your character has a background of being a great athlete, well, the game master may say, okay, yeah, maybe you are more good at that. So by the situation, the game master may decide different difficulties. So it's very an introduction. I found this book on eBay. It's not available anymore, but it's the same thing as the normal game books. So if you have that, you can do this game easily without having it. And you want to introduce your kids, it could be a good game to do that. Every weapon does the same damage. It's 2, you lose 2 stamina for every hit. After that, they wanted to make a more complete role-playing game. This one. Called Dungeoneer, and it's written Advanced Fighting Fantasy here. Basically, it's the same game as the one I've shown you before, but they make more kind of they developed a more complete skill system. So you could have skill to do different tasks, and they have number to that. Combat was a little more precise. You could do kind of maneuvers that gives penalties or bonus. The weapons don't do 2 stamina point at every hit, but they have some kind of different damage. It's an improvement if you want a more complete role-playing game. But I've read it, and what I could say about that is that it loses from the feel of the game book. That's my opinion. The game is not bad in itself, but there's a magic system, and it's nothing like we see in the game books. It's something a little different. It has a different feel, and and the way that the characters, in that the characters gain experience and are getting better game by game. Not in there. the way they do that, there's something not quite in my taste. Um, but the game is okay, and you can find this book very cheap on the internet, on eBay and all that. But I think on the long term, this game has its limits. If you do a spellcaster, you can be it's very unbalanced to do a spellcaster in that, and your character is generated randomly, so you can have very tough characters or very weak ones. In this game, if your stat varies just by 1 point, it has a big impact. But that is the advanced fighting fantasy that came out. This book comes with 2 scenarios, and well, they guide you through how to play the game with that. So that's what was before 2nd edition. Now, today I'm gonna talk to you about the Quickstart rules that you can find free on Drivethrurpg. The link will be below. The Quickstart rules for Advanced Fighting Fantasy, the 2nd edition. The Quickstart rules is the first chapter of this book is exactly what you find in the Quickstart rules. So, the 2nd edition, in my taste, if I would have read only that, if I only knew that, I don't know if I would like to play this game, because something felt wrong. Well, that's not what I'm searching for. When I got this game and I read that, I totally fell in love with that, because they are able to recreate the feel of the game books in the game system. So, the introduction, the quick start rules. What do we find here? Well, a small description on how to run a role-playing game. The rules of the game. So you have stats like skill, luck, or magic. If you want to perform something, you check out your skill. You may add a special skill you have related to the action you want to do. You add that together. Roll 2d6. If you're equal or less, you've succeeded. The same goes for luck. Luck can be used for almost anything. It's kind of saving throw, or it can be used in place of skill. And magic, if you want to perform a spell, it's the same thing, equal or less. If you are doing something against another character, instead of rolling equal or less, you add to your score, your skill and special skill score, if it applies, against what your opponent is doing, and the highest roll win. Simple as that. The battles, it's exactly the same as in the game book, so it's an opposed roll, exactly like what I've described just before this. And the highest wins the round, and the winner of the round rolls is damage on the table. I don't know if you see it. Okay. Some people find it confusing, but I like the way they deal weapon damage, because every weapon has its own curve of damage. It's not linear, like you roll 1d6, you have 1 to 6 damage, 1d4, 1 to 4. No, here you see the sword goes from 2 to 4, and you roll, in fact you roll 1d6, and you check out on the table below where it will fall down. Like a sword, you have a big chance of doing 3 of damage, but you can't do below 2. And if you're lucky, you can do 4 stamina points of damage, which is kind of big, because you take a standard goblin, it can have only 4 or 5 stamina points, so you may almost kill him in 1 blow. At least 2 blows will bring him down. It goes, and the same goes for armor. So the loser of a contest in a combat will roll his die and check out his armor. That works the same with the same kind of tables to see how many points he can subtract from the damage. Okay, so if you get to 0 hit points, stamina, you're out of combat. Well, you're not dead here. You have, we'll see that in future videos, but you're not dead. You're kind of mortally wounded. So after that, we get to a small scenario called the well. Without making any spoiler, it's not a very profound adventure. It's kind of a dungeon where you can meet anything. It's not a big masterpiece of a dungeon. You know, you can find a room with a spider attacking you. In the room after that, you have a tavern with a dwarf, a friendly dwarf who serves you a beer. Okay, well, it can be funny. Well, the scenario, without being a great story, is perfect to try out the game and introduce new players to role-playing game, because it will feel like a dungeon you can see in a video game or something like that. Even though if you don't like the dungeon, there's lots of stats of many monsters of the dungeon. It's easy to create your own story using these stats. And the quick start rules finish with pre-generated characters. You have some characters that are suggested to try out the game. There's a human adventurer, a dwarf warrior, an elf wizard. The wizard has a list of spells, and every spells are described here. A human rogue, an elf archer, and that's it. So it will give you an idea on how the game can be run. After that, the game has some more precise things about character creations, rules, more precise rules, but basically the rules you find in the quick start are what you need to run a game. It's the basic. So if you understand that, you can run a game of advanced fighting fantasy. And yeah, so you can check that out since it's free. And with the following video, I will show you some other aspects of the game. And that game, in my opinion, is a great alternate option for an old school kind of a game. Sometimes we refer old school the fantasy gaming with we merge that with Dungeons and Dragons, and yeah, because it's a classic. But sometimes you want something very different, and that is different. It has an old school feel, but the way it's now on the second edition, it's really rules light, and the rules just merge themselves very well. So I highly recommend this game. So check that out with the quick start rules. So stay tuned for more. The next video will be about character creation. We'll have a special guest for that. My name is François Letarte for JDRD30, and up to next time, I hope you have as much fun in your life as in your game.